Picture this. The courtroom falls silent as Judge Walter Simmons leans forward, his silver-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose. He peers over them at Marcus Johnson, a black man standing before the bench in his neatly pressed suit that can't quite hide the military bearing in his shoulders. "Mr. Johnson, I find it curious that someone of your background believes they can adequately represent themselves in my courtroom." The judge's voice carries a hint of amusement that ripples through the gallery. Marcus stands perfectly still, his expression unreadable except for the slight tightening around his eyes. His fingers rest lightly on a leather briefcase that's seen better days. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe I understand the proceedings well enough to—" "Well enough?" Judge Simmons cuts him off with a dismissive wave. "Mr. Johnson, Harvard law wasn't built on well enough. Yale doesn't accept well enough, and my courtroom certainly doesn't operate on well enough. Especially not from someone who's clearly more familiar with taking orders than giving legal arguments." A few nervous chuckles echo from the back of the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers hesitate momentarily above her keyboard. The prosecutor shifts uncomfortably, but says nothing. Marcus absorbs the blow without flinching, though something flashes behind his eyes. A quick calculation, a decision, being made. "Perhaps you'd like to reconsider your choice to proceed without proper counsel," the judge continues, folding his hands. "I'm trying to save you from embarrassing yourself further." Marcus reaches slowly into his briefcase and pulls out a single document. "Actually, Your Honor, I think there's something you should see." The judge sighs dramatically, motioning for the bailiff to bring him the paper. As he scans it, the smug smile freezes on his face. His complexion pales visibly. Little did he know, the man he had been ridiculing wasn't just any veteran trying to muddle through legal proceedings. Marcus Johnson was about to turn this courtroom, and Judge Simmons' world, completely upside down. Let me take you back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Marcus Johnson sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of law books. Early morning light streamed through half-drawn blinds, catching the steam rising from his coffee mug. At 42, his face carried the quiet dignity of someone who had seen much of the world and understood its complications, without becoming cynical. After 15 years of military service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan as an intelligence officer, Marcus had managed to do what many considered impossible: attend and graduate from Harvard Law while still serving his country. It had taken him 7 years of night classes, online courses, and brutal study sessions between deployments, but his law degree now hung framed on the wall beside his military commendations. "Dad, you're going to be late for your meeting," called out Zoe, his 16-year-old daughter, as she grabbed a piece of toast from the counter. Her school backpack was already slung over one shoulder. "Just finishing some notes," Marcus replied, closing one book and opening another. "Mr. Winters deserves the best defense I can give him." Marcus had opened his small practice in their suburban community just outside of Boston 2 years ago. He specialized in veterans' issues and community legal aid, charging minimal fees to those who could afford it and working pro bono for those who couldn't. His reputation for thoroughness and integrity had begun to spread beyond the veteran community. "You always say that," Zoe smiled, dropping a kiss on top of his head. "That's why you're always working while other lawyers are playing golf." Marcus laughed. "Golf was never my game. Besides, Mr. Winters spent 30 years building his auto shop. He deserves to keep it, especially when the city's eminent domain claim is on such shaky legal ground." He gathered his notes into his worn leather briefcase, a gift from his own father when he had passed the bar exam. The briefcase had become something of a good luck charm, though Marcus would never admit to such superstitions. Their modest home in Oakwood Heights was a 20-minute drive from the courthouse. As Marcus drove through the tree-lined streets, he mentally rehearsed his arguments for the preliminary hearing. The neighborhood had changed in recent years, with new developments pushing in and property values rising. Good for homeowners, perhaps, but it had also brought increasing pressure on long-standing local businesses like Winters Auto Shop. Pulling into the courthouse parking lot, Marcus noticed a sleek black Mercedes in the reserved judicial parking space. Judge Walter Simmons had arrived early. Marcus had never appeared before Simmons, but had heard plenty about him. Harvard-educated, connected to old Boston money, and known for running an efficient if somewhat imperious courtroom. As Marcus walked toward the courthouse steps, he felt someone watching him. Glancing up, he caught sight of a figure in the second-floor window, Judge Simmons, staring down at the parking lot, his expression unreadable behind the reflection on his glasses. Their eyes met briefly before the judge turned away from the window. Marcus shook off the odd feeling that crept along his spine. He had faced far more intimidating situations than a haughty judge. He straightened his tie, adjusted his grip on his briefcase, and climbed the steps to the courthouse doors. Inside courtroom 3, Marcus settled at the defendant's table beside Mr. Winters, a stooped man with calloused hands and worried eyes. The courtroom was modestly filled, a few reporters covering the eminent domain case, some concerned community members, and the usual courthouse staff. All rise for the Honorable Judge Walter Simmons, the bailiff announced, and everyone stood as the judge entered, his black robes flowing behind him. Judge Simmons took his seat, arranged his papers, and looked out over the courtroom with an air of casual authority. When his gaze landed on Marcus, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, from their brief eye contact earlier, followed by something harder to define. Case number 2023 CV 4872, City of Boston versus Winters. Eminent domain. Proceeding. Judge Simmons looked down at his docket. I see Mr. Winters is represented by... He paused, peering over his glasses. Marcus Johnson? Are you new to my courtroom, Mr. Johnson? Marcus stood. Yes, Your Honor. This is my first appearance before you. And you're representing Mr. Winters in this matter? Interesting choice, Mr. Winters. The judge's tone held a note of skepticism that wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Mr. Johnson comes highly recommended, Your Honor, Mr. Winters said, quietly. I'm sure he does, the judge replied with a thin smile. Well, let's proceed. City Council, your opening statement. As the city's attorney launched into her statement about public interest and development plans, Marcus noticed Judge Simmons studying him rather than paying attention to the argument. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he rose confidently. Your Honor, the city's claim fails to meet the necessary burden for several reasons. Mr. Johnson, Judge Simmons interrupted. I presume you're familiar with the Supreme Court's ruling in Kelo versus City of New London? Yes, Your Honor. However, and you're aware that it gives quite broad latitude to municipalities in determining what constitutes public use? I am, Your Honor. But if I may, please proceed, the judge said with a dismissive wave, though I suspect you're about to attempt a rather uphill battle. Marcus took a measured breath. The city's development plan specifically targets businesses in the historic mechanics district for repurposing into luxury apartment buildings. This runs contrary to the city's own Historical Preservation Ordinance of 2015, which explicitly protects businesses that have operated in the district for more than 25 years, which Winters Auto Shop has. Judge Simmons raised an eyebrow. An interesting argument, Mr. Johnson. Not entirely without merit, I suppose. He made a note on his pad. Continue. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus presented his argument, citing relevant case law and local ordinances. Each time he made a point, Judge Simmons would interrupt with a question or comment that seemed designed less to clarify and more to undermine. Your Honor, Marcus said at last, we also have affidavits from 17 local business owners who will be similarly affected by this development plan, all stating that they were given no opportunity for community input, contrary to Section 8 of the city's own development transparency requirements. Mr. Johnson, while your enthusiasm is commendable, I must remind you that this courtroom operates on legal precedent, not community sentiment, Judge Simmons said. The city has presented a development plan that appears, on its face, to meet the requirements of the law. With respect, Your Honor, the law also requires procedural fairness, which these documents demonstrate was lacking. Marcus held up a folder of affidavits. The judge sighed. Submit them for the record. We'll take a 15-minute recess while I review these documents. He stood, adjusting his robes. Though I must say, Mr. Johnson, I'm surprised you didn't bring these issues up during the preliminary discovery phase. It suggests a certain inexperience with proper procedure. As the judge exited to his chambers, Marcus returned to his seat beside Mr. Winters, who looked confused and worried. Is he always like that? Marcus asked quietly. Mr. Winters nodded. That's Judge Simmons. My neighbor had a case before him last year. Said he treats the courtroom like his personal kingdom. When court resumed, Judge Simmons returned looking irritated. I've reviewed the submitted materials. While there are some procedural questions raised, they're not sufficient to dismiss the city's petition outright. However, he added, glancing at Marcus, they do warrant further examination. This hearing will be continued next Monday to allow the city to respond to these allegations of procedural deficiencies. The city's attorney stood. Your Honor, we're prepared to address these concerns today. I'm sure you are, Ms. Daniels. But I have another matter on the docket in 30 minutes, and I suspect Mr. Johnson here would benefit from the additional time to further prepare his case. The judge's smile didn't reach his eyes. Court is adjourned until Monday, 9 a.m. As people filed out of the courtroom, Marcus was approached by the city's attorney, Rebecca Daniels. That was unusual, she said. Simmons typically rules quickly on these matters, almost always in the city's favor. Is that so? Marcus replied, packing his notes. Look, you've clearly done your homework, Daniel said, lowering her voice. The procedural violations are real. The city rushed this through because Councilman Harding's brother-in-law is the developer. I can't say that officially, but she shrugged. Just watch yourself with Simmons. He and Harding are golf buddies. Thanks for the heads up, Marcus said. As Marcus walked Mr. Winters to his car, he noticed Judge Simmons watching them from the courthouse steps. When their eyes met, the judge didn't look away, but instead offered a small, cold smile before turning to speak to a well-dressed man beside him, a man Marcus recognized from news photos as Councilman Harding. Over the next 2 weeks, the Winters case took several unexpected turns. At the Monday continuation, Judge Simmons seemed better prepared to counter Marcus's arguments, citing obscure precedents that appeared to have been researched specifically to undermine the defense. When Marcus attempted to enter additional evidence of the city's procedural violations, the judge ruled them inadmissible on technical grounds. Mr. Johnson, while your creative approach to legal defense is noteworthy, this court operates on established procedure, not improvisation, Judge Simmons remarked, drawing quiet laughter from the city's side of the courtroom. After the third hearing, Marcus was approached by Judge Andrea Monroe, who presided over family court in the same building. Mr. Johnson, she said, catching him in the hallway. I've been following the Winters case with interest. Your argument about the Historical Preservation Ordinance was quite compelling. Thank you, Your Honor, Marcus replied, surprised by the unexpected support. Don't be discouraged by Judge Simmons, she continued in a lower voice. He can be difficult, especially with new attorneys, but your work is solid. The appellate court would likely be interested in his handling of the procedural evidence, should it come to that. The encouragement was welcome, but Marcus was beginning to suspect that more than judicial temperament was at play. Twice now, he had spotted Judge Simmons in close conversation with Councilman Harding outside the courthouse. The fourth hearing brought matters to a head. Marcus arrived to find a revised development plan had been submitted by the city, one that specifically amended the historic mechanics district boundaries to exclude Winters' auto shop by a mere 50 feet. Your Honor, this last-minute boundary revision is clearly an attempt to circumvent the very ordinance that should protect my client, Marcus argued. Mr. Johnson, the city has the authority to amend its districts as needed for development purposes, Judge Simmons replied coolly. The fact that you weren't anticipating this standard procedural move suggests a certain naivety about municipal law. Standard procedure requires public notice and a comment period before district boundaries can be modified, Marcus countered. This was done yesterday. The emergency provision in the city charter allows for expedited modifications when time-sensitive development opportunities arise, the judge said. Perhaps you're not familiar with that provision? Each hearing followed a similar pattern. Marcus would present soundly reasoned legal arguments, only to have Judge Simmons dismiss or undermine them with increasingly personal remarks about Marcus's experience, background, or understanding of the law. Mr. Johnson, did they teach this approach at— Where did you study law again? The judge asked during one particularly tense exchange. Harvard Law, Your Honor, Marcus replied evenly. Class of 2017. A flicker of surprise crossed the judge's face before he composed himself. Well, even Harvard has its outliers, I suppose. After the fifth hearing, Marcus decided more direct evidence was needed. He began documenting every interaction with Judge Simmons, recording dates, times, and exact quotes. He requested court transcripts for all proceedings. He researched the judge's ruling history on similar cases and found a pattern of favoritism toward developers with connections to certain city council members. One evening, while working late at the courthouse to review records, Marcus overheard a conversation from the judge's conference room where the door had been left slightly ajar. The Johnson problem is becoming irritating, Judge Simmons's voice carried clearly. He's filing motion after motion, delaying what should have been a simple ruling. Walter, you need to be careful, a female voice, Judge Monroe replied. Johnson knows what he's doing. His motions have merit. Merit? He's a veteran playing at being a lawyer, Simmons scoffed. Probably used some diversity program to get his degree. He doesn't belong in my courtroom, and I'm not about to let him derail a development project that's been in the works for over a year. That's precisely the kind of statement that could cause problems if it ever came to light, Monroe warned. The man graduated from Harvard Law while serving his country. And I've been on this bench for 20 years, Simmons replied. Trust me, Andrea. I know how to handle this. Marcus silently retreated, his suspicions confirmed. The case wasn't being decided on legal merit, but on personal bias and outside interests. The next day, Marcus filed a motion requesting Judge Simmons recuse himself due to potential conflicts of interest, citing the judge's personal relationship with Councilman Harding. When the motion was heard, Judge Simmons's face darkened with anger. "Mr. Johnson, this motion borders on contempt of court," he snapped. "You're accusing me of impropriety based on hearsay and speculation. I've included documentation of 7 instances where Your Honor and Councilman Harding were observed in private conversation outside normal professional contexts during the period this case has been active," Marcus replied calmly. "Social acquaintance is not grounds for recusal, Mr. Johnson." Motion denied. The judge's knuckles were white where he gripped his gavel. "Now, unless you have actual legal arguments to present regarding the eminent domain proceeding, I suggest you stop wasting this court's time." Marcus nodded, outwardly composed while internally recalculating his approach. "Very well, Your Honor. In that case, I'd like to present evidence that the property valuation submitted by the city significantly undervalues my client's business based on deliberately outdated comparable sales data." The hearing continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The judge's antagonism toward Marcus was now barely concealed, and his rulings increasingly one-sided. As they left the courthouse, Mr. Winters looked defeated. "They're going to take my shop, aren't they?" he asked. "Not if I can help it," Marcus replied. "But we need to try a different approach. Judge Simmons isn't going to rule in our favor, no matter what legal arguments we present." That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him, mapping out possibilities. His daughter Zoe brought him a cup of coffee and peered over his shoulder. "That's a lot of notes, Dad," she observed. "Tough case?" "Tough judge," Marcus corrected. "He's decided against us before hearing the evidence. Now I need to figure out why and how to counter it." "Can't you report him or something?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Judicial complaint processes are slow, and we don't have that kind of time. Besides, judges have wide latitude in how they run their courtrooms." He stared at his notes, thinking about Judge Simmons's dismissive comments, his connection to Councilman Harding, and the revised district boundaries that so conveniently excluded Winter's auto shop. "What we need," Marcus said slowly, "is leverage, and a different venue." The final hearing for the Winters case was scheduled for a Monday morning. Judge Simmons entered the courtroom looking confident, nodding to the city's attorneys as he took his seat. "Before we begin, Your Honor," Marcus said, standing, "I'd like to inform the court that I've filed a federal civil rights action regarding this case." The judge froze. "Excuse me?" "A civil action under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Your Honor, alleging discriminatory impact in the city's revised districting that disproportionately targets minority-owned businesses in the historic Mechanics District." The city's attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing of any such filing, because it was filed this morning," Marcus explained. "And since it raises federal questions, I've also filed a motion to remove this case to federal court." He pulled out a document and handed copies to the bailiff. "I have the acknowledgement of filing here." Judge Simmons took the document, his face darkening as he read. "Mr. Johnson, this is a transparent attempt to shop for a different forum after receiving unfavorable rulings in this court." "Not at all, Your Honor. The civil rights implications only became apparent after the city's recent districting changes, which affected 8 businesses, 7 of which are minority-owned. That creates a federal question that takes precedence over the state eminent domain proceeding." The judge's hands trembled slightly as he set the paper down. "This court will take a brief recess while I review these documents." In the judge's chambers, Walter Simmons paced furiously, phone pressed to his ear. "He's filed in federal court, Richard," he hissed to Councilman Harding. "A civil rights case, of all things. How the hell did he connect those dots?" "Calm down, Walter," Harding replied. "The federal case will take months, maybe years. We can still proceed with the eminent domain. Not if he gets the removal granted, which any federal judge worth their salt will do given the circumstances. Did you know that 7 of the 8 affected businesses are minority-owned? Did you even check before you redrew those boundaries?" "That's just coincidence," Harding insisted. "The properties were selected based on location, not ownership." "Tell that to a federal judge," Simmons snapped. "This Johnson character is smarter than you gave him credit for. If this goes to federal court, every ruling I've made will be scrutinized." "So deny the removal," Harding suggested. "I can't just deny it without cause. He's followed proper procedure." Simmons ran a hand through his thinning hair. "And if the transcripts from my courtroom get reviewed alongside this civil rights claim, some of my comments could be misconstrued." "What comments?" "Nothing specific, just I may have been a bit dismissive of his credentials." Standard courtroom banter. There was silence on the other end of the line. "Walter, tell me you didn't make any comments about his race or background." Simmons didn't answer immediately. "Not explicitly, no." "Jesus, Walter." Harding's voice dropped. "Handle this quietly. The development can't afford this kind of delay or publicity." When court resumed, Judge Simmons looked markedly less confident. After reviewing the filing, this court will grant a 2-week continuance to allow all parties to prepare arguments regarding the removal motion. Marcus stood. Your Honor, federal procedure requires an immediate stay of all state proceedings once a removal notice is filed. The case is effectively in federal jurisdiction unless and until a federal judge remands it back to state court. The judge's jaw tightened. Mr. Johnson is correct, he conceded reluctantly. This matter is stayed pending the federal court's decision on jurisdiction. Court is adjourned. As people filed out of the courtroom, Judge Simmons called out, Mr. Johnson, a moment in my chambers, please. Behind closed doors, the judge's demeanor changed completely. That was quite a maneuver, counselor, he said, attempting a collegial tone. Creative use of civil rights law. The facts supported it, Marcus replied simply. Look, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot, Simmons offered. I may have been unnecessarily harsh in some of my comments. The pressures of the docket, you understand. I understand many things, Your Honor, including that judicial bias has no place in a court of law. The judge's face hardened. Careful, counselor. Accusations of bias are serious matters. They are indeed, Marcus agreed. Almost as serious as a judge collaborating with city officials to target specific properties for development. That's an outrageous claim. Is it? I have documentation of your meetings with Councilman Harding throughout this proceeding. I have the transcript where you dismissed procedural violations that would have been grounds for dismissal in any impartial court. And I have witnesses who overheard your comments about my qualifications and background. The judge's face paled, slightly. What exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm stating facts that will become part of the federal record, unless this matter is resolved appropriately. Are you threatening me, Mr. Johnson? Marcus shook his head. No, Your Honor. I'm advocating for my client. Mr. Winters deserves fair treatment under the law, regardless of who wants his property or why. Judge Simmons stared at Marcus for a long moment. What would appropriate resolution entail in your view? The city withdraws its eminent domain claim, returns the historic mechanics district to its original boundaries, and agrees to include community input in any future development plans. And if that happens, then the federal civil rights case becomes moot and can be withdrawn. My client keeps his business. The city avoids a protracted and potentially embarrassing federal case, and everyone moves forward. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with new eyes. You've been 3 steps ahead this entire time, haven't you? Marcus simply waited, his expression neutral. I'll speak to the city attorneys, Simmons said finally. No promises, but I suspect they'll see the wisdom in avoiding federal intervention. 3 days later, the city filed a motion to withdraw its eminent domain petition against Winters Auto Shop. A week after that, the city council held an emergency session to restore the original historic mechanics district boundaries and establish a new community oversight committee for future development plans. News of the sudden reversal spread quickly through the legal community. Local papers ran stories about the David versus Goliath victory of a small auto shop against city developers. Marcus's phone began ringing with calls from other business owners facing similar situations. Judge Simmons, meanwhile, found himself under unofficial scrutiny. Other attorneys began citing the Winters case when appearing in his courtroom, subtly reminding him that his rulings were being watched more closely now. The most satisfying moment came 2 months later, when Marcus was appointed to the city's new Community Development Advisory Board, alongside Judge Andrea Monroe. At their first meeting, Councilman Harding was noticeably uncomfortable as Marcus presented guidelines for equitable development practices. These guidelines are designed to ensure that development serves the entire community, not just select interests, Marcus explained to the assembled board members and citizens. Some might say they're designed to obstruct progress, Harding countered. Only those who define progress as benefiting the few at the expense of the many, Marcus replied evenly. But I believe Boston is better than that. The audience's applause made it clear where public sentiment lay. Mr. Winters's auto shop continued to operate as it had for 30 years, with a new sign added to the front, proudly serving the historic mechanics district. Marcus's legal practice grew, with a focus on community advocacy and civil rights. The worn leather briefcase remained his constant companion, now carrying even more weight in local courtrooms. And Judge Walter Simmons? He developed a surprising new reputation for scrupulous adherence to procedural fairness, particularly in cases involving small business owners and property rights. Whether this transformation stemmed from genuine reflection or practical self-preservation remained known only to him. 1 year after the Winters case, Marcus stood at the podium in the Boston Bar Association's annual Community Service Awards ceremony. The room was filled with attorneys, judges, and community leaders, including, at a back table, Judge Walter Simmons. "The law isn't just about precedents and procedures," Marcus said, as he accepted the Public Service Award. "It's about people. It's about communities. And sometimes it's about standing firm when the system tries to brush you aside." His gaze briefly met Judge Simmons's across the room. The judge offered a small, acknowledging nod. "What I learned during my military service applies equally to the law," Marcus continued. "The hardest battles are often fought not on the front lines, but in quiet rooms where decisions are made, and the most important weapon isn't force, but persistence." The audience applauded warmly. Among them, Mr. Winters beamed with pride, seated at a table with other business owners from the historic Mechanics District, now a thriving area that had become a model for community-centered urban development. After the ceremony, several law students approached Marcus, eager for advice. "How did you take on a judge like Simmons and win?" one asked. Marcus smiled. "I didn't set out to take on a judge. I set out to protect my client's rights. The rest followed naturally." "But weren't you intimidated? He has such a reputation." "Everyone has a reputation of some kind," Marcus replied. "The question is whether they've earned it, and whether they live up to it when challenged." Later that evening, as Marcus was leaving, Judge Simmons approached him in the parking lot. "Congratulations on the award, counselor," the judge said. "Well deserved." "Thank you, Your Honor. You know, I've been on the bench for over 20 years, Simmons said, looking out at the city lights. "Sometimes we begin to believe we are the law, rather than its servant." He turned to Marcus. "It takes courage to remind us of the difference." Marcus nodded, understanding the closest thing to an apology he was likely to receive. "Your daughter must be proud," the judge added. "I believe she's about college age now?" "She is, starting pre-law at Boston University this fall, following in her father's footsteps. The legal community will be all the better for it." Simmons extended his hand. "I look forward to seeing more of your work in my courtroom, Mr. Johnson. It keeps us all honest." As Marcus drove home, he reflected on how one case had created ripples throughout the community. The historic Mechanics District was now protected by stronger ordinances. The Community Oversight Committee had become a model for other neighborhoods, and a federal grant had been secured to help minority-owned businesses upgrade their facilities. All because one auto shop owner refused to give up, and one attorney refused to be intimidated. In his home office, Marcus added a newspaper clipping about the Community Service Award to a bulletin board already covered with thank you notes from clients and community members. Beside it hung his framed law degree and military commendations, different forms of service to the same ideals of justice and fairness. On his desk sat the worn leather briefcase, still his constant companion in courtrooms throughout the city. It had become something of a symbol in local legal circles. When the briefcase appeared, judges and opposing counsel knew they were in for a thorough, principled legal battle. And in courtrooms across Boston, younger attorneys had begun following Marcus's example, challenging judicial overreach and standing firm against intimidation tactics. The legal culture was shifting, slowly, but perceptibly toward greater accountability and fairness. As for Judge Walter Simmons, he continued to preside over Courtroom 3 with a noticeably different demeanor. The dismissive comments had disappeared, replaced by careful attention to procedural fairness. Whether this change was born of genuine growth or merely self-preservation remained his private secret, but the effect on those seeking justice in his courtroom was the same. Sometimes, the most powerful changes start not with grand gestures, but with one person refusing to be dismissed. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of who they are, only to prove everyone wrong with their excellence? Share your story in the comments below. We all know that feeling when someone tries to put you in a box based on their assumptions, and there's nothing more satisfying than watching those assumptions crumble. If you enjoyed this true underdog story of justice prevailing, hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of people standing up for what's right against the odds. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that persistence and excellence are the best responses to prejudice. Until next time, remember, your background doesn't define your brilliance, and sometimes the person being underestimated is the one holding all the cards.